On the night of the 12th of June, 1923, a mail train known as Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railways, number 57, rolled through the darkened Illinois countryside. Its cargo worth more than $2 million in federal currency, bonds, and registered mail. The men aboard had made this run dozens of times before. It was routine. It was ordinary. And then, at a small wayside stop called Rondout, roughly 30 miles north of Chicago, the train slowed to a crawl, and everything changed. Armed men swarmed the platform, and the cars. Shots cracked through the summer air. Within minutes, one of the most audacious and meticulously planned robberies in American history was underway. Nearly a century later, the full truth of what happened at Rondout and where the missing millions went has never been completely answered. The early 1920s were a contradictory era in American life. The nation had emerged from the Great War flush with industrial confidence, yet riddled with social fractures that no armistice could mend. Prohibition had taken effect in January 1920, and almost immediately it had done something profound and unintended. It handed organized crime and infrastructure. Bootlegging networks spread across the country, and with them came the organizational skills, the muscle, and the financing that criminal enterprises needed to grow bolder. Chicago in particular had become a laboratory for this new criminal order. The city's geography, straddling rail lines, waterways, and roadways between the industrial East and the agricultural Midwest, made it a natural hub for both legitimate commerce and its illicit shadow economy. The United States Post Office in 1923 was among the most trusted institutions in American civic life. It handled not just letters but enormous quantities of financial instruments, currency shipments, bearer bonds, payroll packages, registered packages containing jewelry and securities. These shipments moved by rail, often with minimal armed escort compared to the value they carried. Federal regulations required the Postal Service to transport millions of dollars in currency and negotiable instruments across the country each week, moving from Federal Reserve banks to regional distribution points. The vulnerability was well known in certain criminal circles. What it required was inside information, disciplined organization, and nerve. Law enforcement in 1923 operated in a fundamentally different landscape than today. The Bureau of Investigation, forerunner of the FBI, was a relatively young agency, created only in 1908 and still establishing its jurisdiction and methods. State police forces were in their infancy in many states. Local police departments relied on informants, physical surveillance, and the cooperation of railway detectives, who functioned as a quasi-independent law enforcement arm of the major rail companies. Forensic science was primitive by modern standards. Fingerprinting was used, but crime scene preservation was inconsistent, and criminal databases were held in paper files rather than centralized systems. The radio telephone was just beginning to reach law enforcement. Coordination between agencies depended on telegraph wires and telephone calls that could be hours apart. This was the world into which the Rondout robbery arrived. The man at the center of the robbery's planning was James Murray, a Chicago-based criminal with long-standing connections to the city's underworld. Murray was not a street-level thug. He was an organizer, a fixer, a man who dealt in information, and the information he possessed in the spring of 1923 was specific and extraordinarily valuable. Knowledge of exactly which train would be carrying a particularly large shipment of registered mail from the Chicago Post Office. That knowledge, investigators would later determine, came from sources inside the Postal Service itself. Murray recruited carefully. Among those he brought into the scheme was a man named William Fahy, a postal inspector, a federal employee whose job was ostensibly to protect the very mail that was about to be stolen. On the evening of the 12th of June 1923, Postal inspectors and postal workers had loaded the number 57 at Chicago's Union Station. The registered mail consignment that night was unusually large, containing currency, bonds, and financial instruments destined for banks and Federal Reserve branches across the Midwest and beyond. The precise total value of the shipment has been estimated by federal investigators at between $2 and $3 million, though some contemporary accounts placed it higher. The train departed on schedule, moving north through the city's outskirts and into the farmland beyond. At approximately 9:20 in the evening, the train approached Rondout, a small rural stop in Lake County, Illinois, roughly 30 miles north of the city. According to testimony gathered in the subsequent investigation, a gang of roughly 11 men had positioned themselves at and around the station. Some were on the platform, others waited in automobiles on the roads approaching the stop. When the train slowed, armed men boarded. The robbery was swift and practiced. The postal clerks inside the mail car were ordered at gunpoint to step back. One postal worker, Alf Hansen, was shot during the confrontation, struck in the back as the robbers established control of the car. He survived. No one was killed, though the assault left multiple people injured, including some of the robbers themselves, reportedly from accidental gunfire within their own ranks. The gang worked quickly. They had specific knowledge of which pouches and registered packages contained the most valuable shipments, and they moved through the car with purposeful efficiency rather than the chaotic scrambling of opportunistic criminals. Within a matter of minutes, the sacks were transferred to waiting automobiles. The cars scattered into the Illinois night, heading in multiple directions. By the time local authorities reached the scene, the robbers had dissolved into the countryside. The Rondout robbery had taken less than 30 minutes from first contact to last car departing. What investigators would confront in the hours that followed was a crime scene that raised far more questions than it answered about how such a precise operation had come together. The engineer of number 57 brought the train to a complete halt following the robbery and managed to send a telegraph distress signal from the nearest station north of Rondout. Within the hour, Lake County Sheriff's deputies had arrived at the scene, followed by agents of the Bureau of Investigation summoned by emergency wire from Chicago. The night was warm and humid. The fields surrounding the Rondout stop thick with summer growth that made it nearly impossible to track the departing vehicles by lamplight. Deputies fanned out along the dirt roads radiating from the station, but found nothing beyond tire tracks already beginning to blur in the soft earth. The robbers had clearly chosen Rondout because of its isolation and the multiple escape routes it offered into the farm roads of Lake County. The injured postal worker, Alf Hansen, was transported by automobile to a hospital in the nearest town, where his wound was treated as non-fatal. His account, recorded by investigators at his bedside in the early morning hours of the 13th of June, described the robbers as disciplined and deliberate, men who moved with the efficiency of people who had rehearsed their roles. Hansen recalled that none of the men spoke unnecessarily. Commands were issued in low, firm tones. There was no shouting, no panic, none of the chaotic aggression typical of opportunistic criminal violence. This composure in execution, Hansen's investigators noted in their initial report, suggested not only prior planning but prior experience with controlled criminal operations. These were not amateurs. They were professionals working from a script of their own devising. Bureau of Investigation agents, who arrived in the early morning hours of the 13th of June, found a mail car that had been efficiently emptied of its most valuable cargo. Postal inspectors called to the scene immediately began the painstaking work of accounting for exactly what had been taken. Initial inventory work suggested that the thieves had left behind some parcels of lesser value, while concentrating specifically on the highest value registered shipments. This selectivity reinforced what was already becoming the lead theory. The gang had possessed inside information about the mail car's contents. The question was not whether they had a source inside the Postal Service. The question was who that source was and how deep the corruption ran. The initial days of the investigation proceeded on multiple tracks. Lake County law enforcement focused on the local angle, searching farms, canvassing rural residents, looking for any report of suspicious vehicles or strangers in the area in the days before the robbery. Bureau of Investigation agents moved quickly to Chicago, where the organizational sophistication of the robbery pointed unmistakably toward the city's established criminal networks. Railway detectives from the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul line provided investigators with passenger manifests and any records of unusual interest in the number 57's schedule in recent weeks. Postal inspectors undertook an internal review of everyone with access to information about registered mail shipments. These parallel investigations would eventually converge, but not before weeks of frustrating dead ends. The Bureau of Investigation in 1923 was a young agency still defining its methods and jurisdiction. Its director, William J. Burns, had built the agency's reputation on high-profile cases. But the resources available to field agents were modest. Special agents assigned to the Rondout case operated out of the Chicago field office, working long hours cross-referencing informant intelligence with the physical evidence gathered at the scene. Communication between the Chicago office and Washington headquarters moved by teletype and by letter, creating delays that hindered the coordinated response that the case's complexity demanded. Despite these limitations, the agents assigned to Rondout moved with notable determination, driven in part by the knowledge that the Post Office Department was watching the investigation with acute institutional anxiety. The robbery shocked Chicago and the surrounding region in a way that extended well beyond the monetary loss. The Chicago Tribune ran the story on its front page on the 13th of June, describing it as one of the boldest mail robberies in American history. The Tribune noted the military-like precision of the operation, the apparent inside knowledge the gang had possessed, and the complete failure of law enforcement to intercept any of the participants at the scene. Editorial writers across the Midwest seized on the story as evidence of the broader lawlessness that Prohibition had unleashed. Other Chicago papers, including the Chicago Daily News, published detailed accounts of the robbery's mechanics, drawing on interviews with the shaken postal clerks and railway workers who had been aboard number 57. Small towns in Lake County, the county where Rondout stood, reacted with a mixture of anxiety and fascination. Farmers near the robbery site were interviewed by reporters from multiple papers, describing the quiet ordinariness of the evening before the crime shattered it. Some residents reported hearing automobiles on rural roads at unusual hours in the days preceding the 12th of June, observations that in retrospect suggested the gang had conducted reconnaissance. The rural community's awareness of having harbored, however unknowingly, a criminal operation of this scale produced a lasting unease that local papers reflected in their editorial pages throughout the summer. The United States Post Office Department took an unusually direct public stance in the days following the robbery. Postmaster General Harry New issued a statement expressing alarm at the robbery and pledging full federal resources to the investigation. The post office had been grappling with a wave of mail robberies in the early 1920s. The Rondout heist was the largest, but not the only such crime of the era. Congress had recently authorized increased penalties for mail robbery, and the post office had been pressing for greater coordination with federal law enforcement. The Rondout robbery, given its scale and audacity, immediately became a high-priority federal case. Attorney General Harry Daugherty, himself under scrutiny for unrelated corruption matters, publicly demanded results and assigned additional Bureau of Investigation resources to the case within the first week. The physical evidence gathered at Rondout in the aftermath of the robbery was frustratingly thin. The robbers had left behind no weapons at the scene. The tire tracks discovered on the approach roads were of common commercial manufacture. offering no distinctive identification. Several shell casings were recovered inside the mail car, consistent with revolvers of common make and caliber. Fingerprint examination of the mail car surfaces was conducted, but the car's normal heavy use by postal workers made it impossible to isolate prints that could be attributed to the robbers. No civilian witnesses had observed the departure of the getaway vehicles in enough detail to provide useful vehicle or suspect descriptions. The single most significant failure of the physical investigation was that the gang had left the scene almost entirely clean, a level of discipline that suggested the planning phase had included specific instructions about not leaving identifiable material behind. Investigators also examined the financial records of businesses and individuals with known underworld connections in Chicago, looking for unusual cash deposits or bond transactions in the weeks following the robbery. This work was slow and imprecise by modern standards, conducted without the electronic systems or centralized banking records that would later make such inquiries more tractable. Federal agents worked with Chicago area banks directly, requesting cooperation that was sometimes forthcoming and sometimes delayed by banking officials uncertain of their legal obligations. The financial trail, such as it was, grew cold faster than investigators could follow it. By July of 1923, the money had effectively vanished from any ledger that law enforcement could read. The most promising early lead came not from physical evidence, but from the injury sustained by one of the robbers. Contemporary reports, later confirmed in court proceedings, indicated that at least one member of the gang had been accidentally shot during the robbery itself, struck by a bullet from a fellow gang member's weapon during the confusion of the mail car takeover. Investigators quietly contacted hospitals and physicians throughout northern Illinois and the Chicago metropolitan area, requesting reports of any gunshot wound treatment in the days following the 12th of June. This surveillance of the medical community was a recognized investigative technique of the era, and it would eventually yield results, but the information came weeks later, during a period when the gang had already dispersed and the money had moved. The internal investigation within the United States Post Office Department moved faster than the criminal inquiry. Postal inspectors conducting their review of personnel with access to the number 57S shipment information had, within weeks, developed serious suspicion about William Fahy, the postal inspector whose territory included the Chicago distribution operations. Fahy's behavior in the weeks following the robbery was noted as unusual by colleagues. His financial circumstances appeared inconsistent with his federal salary. Under extended questioning by superior inspectors, Fahy's account of his movements and knowledge developed troubling inconsistencies. By late summer of 1923, Bureau of Investigation agents working in cooperation with postal inspectors had begun building a file on Fahy as a central figure in the conspiracy. James Murray was identified separately through Chicago underworld informants, who, with characteristic wariness, provided information in fragments rather than in direct testimony. The use of criminal informants in this era was a double-edged investigative tool. Information obtained from underworld sources was rarely usable directly in court proceedings, and informants routinely withheld the most sensitive details as leverage for their own protection. Bureau of Investigation agents learned to triangulate, gathering fragments from multiple sources and assembling a mosaic that, piece by piece, began to resemble a coherent picture of the conspiracy. Murray's name appeared in multiple intelligence reports as someone who had been making unusual inquiries about rail mail shipments in the months before the robbery. Surveillance of Murray through the summer of 1923 produced observations of meetings with known criminal associates, and investigators believed, with individuals who had access to mail handling operations. The difficulty was translating surveillance observations into admissible evidence in an era when the legal standards for warrants, searches, and the use of informant testimony were considerably less settled than they would later become. The investigative breakthrough, when it came, derived from a combination of the gunshot wound inquiry and intensifying pressure on the gang's peripheral members. By autumn of 1923, Bureau of Investigation agents had developed enough information to begin making arrests. Murray was taken into federal custody. Fahy, confronted with the evidence against him, ultimately cooperated with prosecutors. Other gang members were arrested in sequence through late 1923 and into 1924. The trials that followed attracted national attention. Fahy's testimony as a cooperating witness provided the clearest account of the conspiracy's inside mechanics: how Murray had recruited him, how shipment information was passed, how the robbery itself had been choreographed. Multiple defendants received federal prison sentences, but the convictions answered only the who. The where remained entirely unresolved. From the moment investigators tallied the missing cargo, it was clear that only a fraction of the Rondout loot had been recovered. Some currency and bonds were traced and seized in connection with the arrests, but the bulk of the stolen money, estimates of the unrecovered portion ranged from $1.5 to nearly $2 million, simply did not surface during the investigation or the trial proceedings. Defendants claimed ignorance of where the money had gone. Murray, who stood at the center of the conspiracy and would logically have controlled the distribution of the proceeds, led Red investigators Little Thito recovery. The large denomination currency and negotiable bonds that formed the most valuable portion of the haul were, by their nature, difficult to trace once they left the mail car. Theories about the missing money were plentiful in the months and years after the trial. Some investigators believed that a portion of the funds had been converted to cash equivalents and filtered through Chicago area businesses with underworld connections, gradually laundered into the legitimate economy through layers of transactions that left no clear trail. Others suspected that a significant sum had been divided and physically hidden, buried or cached, in locations known only to the conspirators who chose not to reveal them. A third theory, circulated in law enforcement circles, held that some of the bonds had been smuggled out of the country through networks with connections to criminal enterprises operating in Canada and beyond. The fate of William Fahy after his cooperation with prosecutors illustrated the ambiguous rewards of turning federal witness. He received a reduced sentence in recognition of his testimony, but his career was permanently destroyed and his name permanently associated with the most notorious mail robbery of the decade. Former colleagues in the Postal Inspection Service viewed him with undisguised contempt. His testimony had been essential to securing convictions, yet it had recovered nothing of the stolen money. In the strictly transactional calculus of the investigation, Fahy had given the government what it needed most for the courtroom and withheld, or genuinely could not provide, what it needed most for the ledger. As the years passed and the convicted men served their sentences, interest in the missing money periodically resurfaced. Journalists revisited the case in the 1930s, noting that the passage of time had made recovery of negotiable instruments increasingly unlikely as statutes of limitations on some financial instruments expired. Former postal inspectors interviewed in later years expressed continued frustration at the incomplete resolution. The Post Office Department, for its institutional part, maintained records of the robbery and the investigation in its archives, but the missing money was quietly categorized as unrecovered. The landscape around Rondout has changed substantially over the decades. The small wayside stop that gave the robbery its name no longer functions as a rail station. The farms and fields that once surrounded the platform have given way to suburban development, and the dirt roads down which the getaway cars vanished are now paved. The physical geography that might have preserved any hint of a hidden cache has been transformed by 70 years of growth and construction. Whether anything remains to be found beneath the Illinois soil is a question that cannot be meaningfully answered. The Rondout robbery of 1923 stands as one of the most successfully organized major crimes of its era. Not because the perpetrators escaped justice, for several of them did not, but because the operation achieved what it set out to do. The money was taken. Most of it was never returned. The trial established who had planned and executed the robbery and how they had done it. It did not establish, and could not compel, the answer to the question that lingered longest: where did the money go? William Fahy died having told investigators what they needed to know about the conspiracy's architecture, but not what they most wanted to know about the money. James Murray maintained his silence on the subject through prison and beyond. The other convicted participants similarly offered nothing that led to recovery. Whether this silence reflected genuine ignorance, that the money had been divided and spent in ways untraceable, even to those who had spent it, or a calculated withholding of information that might one day be useful, is something that no document in any federal archive has ever fully clarified. The registered mail pouches that left Rondout on the night of the 12th of June 1923 contained instruments of financial value whose ultimate destinations remain unaccounted for. The Bureau of Investigation closed its active pursuit of the missing funds as a practical matter long before the midpoint of the 20th century. The question of what happened to the Rondout millions passed from active investigation into historical record, a record with a gap at its center that no subsequent inquiry has succeeded in filling. In the long history of American train robbery, Rondout holds a particular place, not as a romantic outlawry of the frontier era, but as a coldly modern crime, organized in a city, enabled by corruption, and executed with a precision that reflected the criminal sophistication of its moment. The men who planned it understood rail operations, federal mail procedures, and the geography of escape. What they left behind was a case that federal investigators could close in the courtroom, but never fully close in the ledgers. Somewhere between the departure of those getaway automobiles into the Illinois night and the present day, more than a century of silence has settled over the question of where the money went, and for now, at least, that silence has not been broken.